Violent crime is decreasing in the U.S., but that doesn't mean it won't be a major issue in this year's presidential campaigns. We're starting this week. It's week 2 of our 10-week Path to the White House initiative here at Scripps News. And this week, we're examining key differences between President Biden and former President Trump and their plans to combat crime and gun violence. Today, Deputy Political Director Joe St. George explains where the candidates stand on gun regulations.
Every corner of this country has been impacted in some way by crime and gun violence. If you've ever been a victim, it may be the biggest issue for you in this election. And like so many other issues, President Biden and former President Trump differ greatly on what should be done. Let's start with the similarities between Trump and Biden on guns. Take, for instance, the issue of bump stocks, devices that modify how fast a gun can be fired, turning them into machine gun-like devices. On this issue, Trump and Biden both support a ban. In fact, former President Trump enacted a bump stock ban when he was in office. On the issue of states passing red flag laws, which temporarily removes firearms from someone deemed a threat, Trump encouraged states to pass them during his first term. President Biden has done the same and funded state programs so they could expand. But after those two issues, it's difficult to find similarities.
When I'm back in the Oval Office, no one will lay a finger on your firearms. It's not going to happen.
The former president is promising to block new gun laws if elected. Meanwhile, President Biden wants new restrictions.
We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
To be clear regarding banning AR-15s, Biden supports a ban, Trump does not. On expanded background checks, President Biden supports them and just finalized a rule to close a loophole which allowed some private gun sales to happen without inquiries. Former President Trump is opposed. President Biden instituted a zero-tolerance policy for gun dealers who violate existing laws. Former President Trump worries that a clerical error could shut down a business. Trump told the NRA this year that he would repeal all of President Biden's executive orders related to guns. Of course, addressing crime and gun violence can involve more than just debates about new gun restrictions. Former President Trump has vowed to send the National Guard into cities that are dealing with a rise in crime. Meanwhile, President Biden has stressed that gun violence is down. Homicides declined by around 13% last year nationwide. President Biden's Justice Department has spent millions on crime prevention task forces in recent years, including new initiatives like ones to combat carjacking. Joe St. George, Scripps News, Washington.
Let's go deeper today. Joining me now is John Lott, Jr. He is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, also worked in the Justice Department in the Trump administration. He's also the author of the book, More Guns, Less Crime, Understanding Crime and Gun Control Laws. Thank you for being here. John, so we just heard some of the differences in the Biden and Trump worldviews and approaches to gun control. And gun control, I'd say it's always a big topic, but rarely the topic when it comes to how people cast their votes. What do you predict in 2024?
Well, I think it's going to be a big issue for many reasons. I mean, one, the Biden administration's put literally thousands of gun dealers out of business. The zero tolerance policy that you mentioned in your setup there, basically, if somebody makes a paperwork mistake, a trivial one that's inconsequential, they'll take away their license. There was a case in Texas recently where a man 17 and 18 years ago had transposed 2 letters in one word each in each of the forms. The Obama administration had looked at it and said this is inconsequential, gave them a minor fine. They've made no other typos in any form in the remaining 17 years. The Biden administration looked through the 17 years, couldn't find anything, reopened those 2 cases in order to take away the person's license to be able to sell guns. Those are the types of people that they're putting out of business. But there are 2 things I want to mention really briefly. One is, you mentioned violent crimes falling. It depends on how you measure it. There's 2 different measures we have. We have the FBI Uniform Crime Reports that counts the number of crimes reported to police. And then we have the National Crime Victimization Data, which tries to measure both total crimes, both reported and unreported. And while the FBI data has shown drops in violent crime over the last 2 years, what you've seen in total crimes, reported and unreported, are huge increases, a 29% increase in just the last year, if you look at total violent crime.
Okay. So a lot of those, yeah, I always see the data coming out and people squabbling over, is it up, is it down, which city is going up, which state is going down, and all of this. So again, I anticipate those things, will continue. But in your book, you discuss the idea that more guns equals less crime. Now, I just pulled the numbers from Johns Hopkins a few minutes ago, and it says, let me quote here, the U.S. has the highest firearm ownership and the highest firearm death rates of 27 high-income countries. How can you say that more guns equals less crime?
Well, first of all, if you look at gun possession, there are countries like Switzerland that have much higher gun possession rates than we have here in the United States. Israel also is much higher. The government may technically own a lot of those guns that are there, but in terms of possession rather than ownership, that's one big difference there. But look, there's few academics make purely cross-sectional comparisons across places. What you try to look at is before and after changes. In every place in the world, for example, that's banned either all guns or all handguns, every single time murder rates have gone up. There's not one time where it's even stayed the same, let alone dropped. And if you think on net guns are bad, you should find lots of cases where either all guns or all handguns have been banned, that murder rates had fallen or at least stayed the same, and yet every single time it's gone up. It's just not Chicago and Washington, D.C., where we had handgun bans in the United States. You see that even in island nations around the world, which you would think would be kind of the ideal experiments for gun control.
So let's say we want to do this smart, because a lot of people are going to hear that and say, okay, you have the numbers, but that doesn't make intuitive sense to me, and you're kind of at loggerheads. If you do want to get smarter about how we regulate guns, respecting the Second Amendment, how do we do it?
Well, I think one of the things you have to realize, first of all, 92% of violent crimes don't involve guns, all right? Police are extremely important in stopping crime, but the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And the question is, what should people do to protect themselves?
No, I'm sorry, John.
And what you find is that there's...
John, sorry, 1 second. Violent crime could be anything. That could be somebody slapping me in the face. I'm talking about deadly crime. People worry about that. And we should say most people dying are dying by suicide, but violent crime is a concern. You mentioned D.C. I live in D.C. There are a lot of guns on the streets, and it can be quite scary at times. If you propose to a lot of people, do you want more guns on the streets? Most people would say, absolutely not. So tell me, what do we do to be smart about it?
Well, I mean, when I talked about violent crime, I'm talking about aggravated assaults, which involve either real harm to people or a weapon being involved. You're talking about rapes, you're talking about murders, you're talking about robberies. And so when you're talking about all violent crime, 92% of violent crime, I'm not talking about simple assault where somebody's just being slapped. That's not what I'm talking about. 92% of violent crime doesn't involve guns in any way. But look, if my research convinces me of anything, the two groups of people who benefit the most from owning guns are the most vulnerable people in our society. They're the people who are the most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas. It'd be great if the police were there all the time to protect them, but they're not. And the other group of people are people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a young male doing the attack. And when a man is attacking a woman, there's a much larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in their ability to go and protect themselves. Look, right now in a city like New Orleans, it's 36 minutes in an emergency where the criminal is there for police to be able to go and respond. You have other places around the country where they won't even send out police right now because of the shortages of police officers that are there. And so the question is, what should people do? And look, my concern is that a lot of these gun control laws simply make it more costly, more difficult for the most vulnerable people to be able to go and protect themselves. You're in D.C. To go and do a background check on a private transfer of a gun is $125. That may not stop you or I from getting a gun.
Right, and it's a quite complicated, lengthy, you know, it's a bit of a journey to get one in D.C. I got you. John Lott Jr. with the Crime Prevention Research Center. I appreciate you being here. A robust conversation on this clearly is appropriate. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.